You're making more money than you ever have, and somehow it still feels like you're one bad month away from things getting uncomfortable. That quiet tension you feel when you open your bank app in the morning, that moment where you start doing mental math without even realizing it, that's not just you being anxious. That's something deeper, and the part that bothers me is how normal it has started to feel. There's this moment that keeps happening to me, and I don't think I'm the only one. It's early, the house is quiet, coffee is brewing, and for a second it feels like you finally have control over your day. Then you check your numbers, not because anything is wrong, but because you want to stay on top of things. You scroll for a few seconds, and suddenly your brain switches into calculation mode, trying to predict what the next few weeks are going to look like. Nothing is technically broken, nothing is overdue, but there's this low-level pressure that never really goes away. Welcome to Dom Finance, I am Dom. If you've ever had that feeling, where life looks good on paper but still feels tight behind the scenes, you're in the right place. Go ahead and hit subscribe and like the video, because what we're talking about here is something most people experience but almost nobody explains clearly. What's been bothering me lately is not that I'm struggling, but that I'm doing well and still don't feel ahead. I'm earning more than I did in my 20s, my lifestyle has improved in ways that used to feel out of reach, and from the outside everything looks like progress. But when I look a little closer, it doesn't feel like progress as much as it feels like maintenance. It feels like I've built something that requires constant effort just to keep it running. And that's where the question started for me. If I'm not making obvious mistakes, then why does it still feel like I can't slow down? Why does it feel like I always need the next paycheck to keep everything stable? That question led me down a path I didn't expect, because the answer wasn't about cutting small expenses or finding a better budget. The answers started to show up in the decisions that looked the most reasonable. The upgrades that felt earned, the commitments that felt responsible, the changes that made life more comfortable in the moment. None of them felt like mistakes, and that's exactly what makes them dangerous. Because what I'm starting to see is that a lot of us are not stuck because we failed, we're stuck because we succeeded in a very specific way. We followed a path that looks right, sounds right, and gets approval from everyone around us. But underneath that, something else is happening. The structure of our lives is slowly becoming less flexible, and we don't notice it until it's already tight. I'm still figuring this out myself, and I'm not coming at this like I've got it all solved. What I do have is a growing suspicion that the way most of us think about progress might be incomplete. So in this video, I want to walk through what I've been noticing, the patterns that don't look like problems until they stack up, and how I'm trying to rethink my own decisions before they quietly lock me into something I didn't fully choose. And once you start noticing that feeling, you begin to realize it's not coming from one big mistake, but from a series of small decisions that all made sense at the time. The first pattern I had to confront was something I used to brush off because it sounded too simple to matter. Lifestyle creep is one of those phrases people throw around casually, but when you actually look at how it plays out, it's a lot more structural than it seems. It doesn't show up as a dramatic change, and that's exactly why it slips through unnoticed. It looks like a slightly better apartment, a more comfortable car, or spending a little more on convenience because your time feels more valuable now. None of those decisions feel irresponsible, and that's the point. They feel like progress, like you are finally catching up to the life you worked for. What took me longer to understand is that each upgrade quietly resets your baseline. It raises the amount of money you need every month just to maintain what now feels normal. That shift doesn't hurt immediately, because your income is also higher, so everything still fits. But over time, your margin starts to shrink, and the space between what you earn and what you keep becomes tighter than you expected. You don't notice it in one moment, you feel it gradually, like something closing in just enough to make you aware of it. Then there is the second layer, which is where things become harder to reverse. It's not just that we spend more, it's how we choose to pay for that comfort. I used to think of financing as a neutral tool, something that helps spread out large expenses in a manageable way. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that it changes the nature of the decision itself. When you focus on the monthly payment, the purchase feels smaller, more reasonable, easier to justify. But what you're actually doing is committing your future income before it even arrives. That shift matters because it turns flexibility into obligation. The thing you bought stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like a requirement. After a few months, the upgrade becomes part of your normal life, but the payment remains a fixed demand on your income. It doesn't adapt when your priorities change, and it doesn't step back when life becomes uncertain. It simply continues, month after month, regardless of what else is happening. This leads into something I hadn't really defined before, but once I saw it, I couldn't ignore it. Every person has a number they need just to keep their life running. Not to grow, not to invest, just to stay where they are. That number is built from everything that cannot easily be reduced or avoided, and it rises with every new commitment you take on. Each individual decision might make sense, but together they create a structure that requires a constant level of income just to hold itself up. At a certain point, that structure starts to shape your behavior. You begin making decisions not based on what you want, but on what you need to sustain it. That's when it stops feeling like you are choosing your life and starts feeling like your life is choosing for you. And the most subtle part of all this is the belief that increasing your income means you are moving forward. It feels logical, and in many ways it is, but it hides a critical detail. If your expenses rise at the same pace as your income, your position hasn't really changed. You are operating at a higher level, but the underlying dynamic is exactly the same. You still depend on that income to maintain everything you've built, and you still feel the pressure to keep it all going. From the outside, it looks like success. From the inside, it can feel like you're carrying something that never gets lighter. And that's what makes these traps so effective, because they don't feel like traps while you're building them. And once you see how those patterns build your life on the surface, the next step is to look at what they're quietly doing underneath over time. This is the part one avoided for a while, because it forces you to stop thinking in months and start thinking in decades, and that shift changes everything. It's easy to justify almost any decision when you look at it 1 month at a time, because most things are manageable in the short term. The real difference only shows up when you stretch the timeline far enough that the math has room to compound. So I tried to simplify it in a way that felt real, not theoretical. I imagined 2 versions of a life that could both belong to someone like me, or honestly, someone like you. Same starting point, same income, same opportunities, but slightly different decisions repeated over time. In one version, this person decides to keep their lifestyle relatively stable as their income grows. They still enjoy life, they still upgrade things occasionally, but they avoid locking themselves into higher monthly obligations. Instead, they consistently set aside around $500 a month and invest it, not because it feels exciting, but because it feels like the right long-term move. In the other version, the person does what most of us naturally do. As income increases, they allow their lifestyle to rise with it. They upgrade their car, improve their living situation, and spend more in ways that feel completely justified. That same $500 still gets used every month, but it goes toward maintaining that upgraded life rather than building something beyond it. At first, these 2 paths don't look very different. In fact, the second one often looks better, because it reflects success more clearly in the present. There is more comfort, more convenience, and more visible progress. Nothing about it feels like a mistake. But the difference begins to show when you give time a chance to do its job. The person who invests consistently starts to build something that grows quietly in the background. The returns begin to generate their own returns, and over time, that steady contribution turns into a meaningful amount of money. It's not dramatic in the beginning, but it becomes significant later, in a way that is hard to replicate once time has passed. The other path doesn't create that effect, not because the person failed, but because their money was already committed elsewhere. It never had the opportunity to compound, because it was being used to support the present instead of building the future. What makes this difficult to accept is that the second path never feels wrong in the moment. There is no clear signal that you are giving something up. There is no immediate consequence that forces you to reconsider. Everything feels reasonable, and that's exactly why it continues. But over time, the gap between these 2 lives becomes more than just a number. It becomes a difference in how each person experiences their life. One has options, room to adjust, and the ability to make decisions from a position of stability. The other becomes more dependent on maintaining the same level of income, because their structure requires it. That dependency changes how you think, how you respond to risk, and how much freedom you actually have, even if everything looks good from the outside. And that's the part that stayed with me. Because it made me realize that the real cost of these decisions isn't just financial, it's optionality. It's the difference between building a life that can evolve, and building one that has to be sustained exactly as it is. Once I saw it that way, it stopped being about how much I was earning, and started being about what my money was actually creating for me over time. And once I understood that the real cost wasn't just money but the loss of options, the question naturally became what I could actually do about it without turning my life upside down. I had no interest in extreme solutions, because those tend to sound good in theory but fall apart in real life. I wasn't going to sell everything, disappear, or pretend that comfort doesn't matter. What I needed was a way to move in a better direction without breaking everything I had already built. That meant focusing less on dramatic changes and more on how I was thinking about my decisions. The first shift that made a real difference was learning to look at my obligations instead of just my spending. I used to track expenses in a general way, making sure nothing was getting out of control, but that only showed part of the picture. What I hadn't been paying attention to was what I was committed to paying every single month, regardless of what happened. When I finally wrote that number down clearly, it changed how I saw everything else. It wasn't just a list of payments, it was a reflection of how much of my future income was already spoken for. Each item on that list represented a decision I had made at some point, and while each one made sense on its own, together they formed a structure that required constant support. That realization made me change the question I was asking. Instead of thinking about whether I could afford something, I started asking whether I wanted to be responsible for it every month going forward. That small shift made decisions feel more real, because it forced me to think beyond the moment and into the commitment. The second shift was more internal, and honestly more difficult to deal with. I had to separate how I saw myself from the lifestyle I was maintaining. There's a subtle pressure to let your external life reflect your progress, and over time that connection becomes stronger than you realize. The things you own and the way you live can start to feel like proof that you're doing well. Once that happens, changing your lifestyle feels personal, even when it shouldn't. Choosing something simpler can feel like stepping backward, even if it actually creates more freedom. I had to sit with that discomfort and recognize that my identity isn't tied to those choices, it's shaped by how intentionally I make them. The third shift was creating a simple filter that I could apply to future decisions without overthinking everything. I needed something clear enough to use in real time, but meaningful enough to guide better choices. The question I landed on was straightforward. Does this decision give me more options, or does it reduce them? That question cuts through a lot of noise. If something increases flexibility, lowers fixed costs, or creates breathing room, it tends to move me in the right direction. If it locks me into higher obligations or makes me more dependent on maintaining a certain level of income, it deserves more scrutiny. This doesn't mean avoiding every upgrade or saying no to everything that adds comfort. It just means being aware of what I'm trading in exchange for that comfort. Because every decision has a cost, even when it doesn't show up immediately. What I'm trying to do now is build a life that doesn't just look stable, but actually feels manageable. A life where I can make decisions without constantly calculating the impact on everything else. That kind of control doesn't come from having the biggest lifestyle, it comes from having enough room to adjust when life inevitably changes. And for me, that's starting to feel like a better definition of progress. And once I started making those changes, even in small ways, I noticed something shift that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with how I felt day to day. It wasn't that everything suddenly became easy, or that all the pressure disappeared, but there was a different kind of awareness that began to settle in. I started to see my life less as something I had to constantly maintain, and more as something I could slowly reshape over time. That shift didn't come from earning more or cutting everything back, it came from understanding what I had been building without realizing it. What stayed with me the most through all of this is a simple question that I didn't ask early enough. It's not about how much money I've made or how much I've saved, it's about what I've committed myself to along the way. Every decision carries forward, and some of them stay with you longer than you expect. Not because they were wrong, but because you didn't fully see what they would require from you later. And I think a lot of people are living with a few of those decisions right now. From the outside, everything looks right, everything looks responsible, but internally there's less room than there should be. Less space to pause, less flexibility to change direction, and less control over how your time and energy are used. That realization changed how I think about what it means to provide, especially for the people who depend on you. Providing isn't just about giving the best possible lifestyle you can afford in the moment, it's about creating a foundation that doesn't collapse under pressure. It's about having enough stability that you don't bring constant stress into the things that matter most. Because people don't just experience what you give them, they experience how you carry it. They feel whether you're present or distracted, whether you're calm or constantly under pressure, and that comes from how your life is structured, not just how much you earn. The issue isn't that people are making reckless choices, it's that they are making reasonable ones without seeing how those choices stack over time. A slightly better lifestyle, a manageable payment, a commitment that feels justified, all of it adds up into something that can quietly reduce your options. At the same time, the solution isn't about rejecting comfort or pretending you don't want a better life. It's about being intentional with what you trade for that comfort. It's about recognizing that every decision either expands your options or slowly takes them away, and over time, that difference becomes more important than any single purchase. What this really comes down to is control. Not control in the sense of perfection, but control in the sense that your life doesn't depend on everything going exactly as planned. When you have that, you think differently, you move differently, and you make decisions from a place of stability instead of pressure. What is one financial commitment in your life right now that you would think twice about if you had to decide today? If you're open to it, drop your answer in the comments so other people can see different perspectives and maybe recognize something in their own situation. And if this kind of conversation helps you think about money in a more honest and practical way, consider subscribing to the channel to support it, because I'll be making more videos like this to break down what actually works in the real world.